Charlotte Williams stood at the tall windows of Kensington Palace watching the morning rain create tiny rivers down the glass. At 28 years old, she had spent the last 5 years navigating the complex world of royal protocols and expectations. Her marriage to Prince Edward had transformed her from a quiet librarian in Yorkshire into a duchess overnight, but the adjustment had been far from easy. The palace corridors echoed with the footsteps of staff members who moved with practiced precision. Everyone knew their place, their role, and most importantly, the unbreakable rules that governed their interactions. Charlotte had learned these rules the hard way, through countless corrections from private secretaries and stern looks from senior household members. Protocol dictated everything in her new life. How she walked, how she spoke, whom she could touch, and when she could show emotion. The guidelines were endless and sometimes felt suffocating. She missed the simple days when she could hug a colleague who was having a bad day, or share a laugh with a stranger at the bus stop. Now every gesture was scrutinized, every expression analyzed by the media and palace staff alike. The household staff, particularly the guards, maintained a professional distance that sometimes felt like an invisible wall. They were trained to be present but unseen, protective but unobtrusive. Charlotte understood their position, but the formal atmosphere often left her feeling isolated, even when surrounded by dozens of people. On this particular Tuesday morning, Charlotte was preparing for what would become one of the most challenging days of her royal life. She had received devastating news the evening before, news that would test every protocol she had learned and ultimately lead to a moment that would change not just her own perspective, but the hearts of those around her. The rain continued to fall as Charlotte's lady-in-waiting, Margaret, entered the room with her daily schedule. Margaret had been with the royal household for over 20 years, and understood the delicate balance between maintaining proper protocol while still showing human compassion. She noticed immediately that something was troubling the Duchess. Charlotte's usual bright demeanor was replaced by a heaviness that seemed to weigh down her shoulders. Her eyes, normally sparkling with curiosity and warmth, appeared distant and troubled. Margaret set down the schedule and waited, knowing that sometimes the most important part of her job was simply being present. The schedule for the day included a visit to a children's hospital, followed by the opening of a new community center and an evening reception for military families. Under normal circumstances, Charlotte would have been excited about these engagements, particularly the hospital visit, as she had always felt most comfortable around children. But today was different. The phone call from her childhood friend Sarah had shattered her carefully maintained composure. Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, Emma, had been diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia. Emma was the same little girl who had been Charlotte's flower girl at the royal wedding. The same child who still sent hand-drawn pictures to Aunt Charlotte every month. Charlotte had known Emma since she was born, had watched her take her first steps, heard her first words, and celebrated every birthday with homemade cakes and silly games. The news hit her like a physical blow, but her royal training had taught her to compartmentalize her emotions, to save her grief for private moments. As she prepared for the day ahead, Charlotte tried to focus on her duties. She knew that hundreds of people were counting on her appearances, that months of planning had gone into each event. The children at the hospital deserved her full attention and enthusiasm, regardless of her personal struggles. The palace guards had already taken their positions throughout the building and along her planned route. Among them was Sergeant James Morrison, a veteran guard who had served the royal family for 15 years. James was known for his unwavering professionalism and his ability to anticipate potential security issues before they arose. James had noticed changes in the Duchess's behavior over the past few months. While maintaining his professional distance, he couldn't help but observe that she seemed increasingly burdened by something. Her smiles, while still genuine during public appearances, didn't quite reach her eyes when she thought no one was looking. The morning briefing for the security team covered the usual protocols for the day's events. Each guard knew their position, their responsibilities, and the importance of maintaining the invisible barrier that protected the royal family while allowing them to connect with the public. They were trained to see everything but react to nothing unless it posed a security threat. As Charlotte made her final preparations, adjusting her hat and checking her appearance one last time, she took a deep breath and tried to summon the strength she would need to get through the day. She thought about Emma, about Sarah's tearful voice on the phone, and about the long battle that lay ahead for their family. The morning light was beginning to filter through the clouds as Charlotte's motorcade prepared to depart for the first engagement. The routine was familiar, the protocols well established, but neither Charlotte nor the guards could have predicted how this day would unfold. In just a few hours, a moment of raw human emotion would break through years of carefully maintained barriers, challenging everything they all thought they knew about duty, protocol, and the power of simple human connection. The seeds of that moment were already planted in Charlotte's heavy heart as she stepped into the waiting car, unaware that her greatest test as a duchess was about to begin. The children's hospital visit began exactly as planned. Charlotte walked through the bright corridors with practiced grace, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted young patients and their families. The hospital staff had spent weeks preparing for her arrival, and everything was proceeding according to the carefully choreographed schedule. But as Charlotte moved from room to room, meeting brave children fighting various illnesses, her thoughts kept drifting to Emma. Each child she met reminded her of her friend's daughter in some way. A girl with pigtails who giggled at Charlotte's jokes, a boy who proudly showed off his drawings, a toddler who reached out with tiny hands wanting to touch the shiny buttons on Charlotte's coat. The hospital's oncology ward was the final stop on her tour. As they approached the children's cancer unit, Charlotte felt her chest tighten. The head nurse, Dr. Patricia Holmes, explained the various treatments and spoke about the courage these young patients showed every day. Charlotte listened intently, but with each word, the reality of what Emma would face became more vivid and heartbreaking. In the playroom, Charlotte sat with a group of children who were between treatments. They were excited to show her their artwork and tell her about their favorite games. One little boy, about Emma's age, had lost all his hair from chemotherapy but beamed with pride as he explained his latest Lego creation. Charlotte managed to maintain her composure throughout the visit, asking thoughtful questions and showing genuine interest in each child's story. The photographers captured beautiful moments of connection, and the hospital staff were delighted with how the visit was going. But inside, Charlotte felt like she was slowly breaking apart. After leaving the hospital, the motorcade proceeded to the community center opening. During the 15-minute drive, Charlotte sat in silence, staring out the window as the city passed by. Her private secretary, thinking she was simply tired, briefed her on the next event, but Charlotte barely heard the words. The community center event was a celebration of local volunteers and their contributions to the neighborhood. Charlotte was scheduled to cut a ribbon, give a short speech, and tour the new facilities. Local dignitaries and volunteers had gathered, many bringing their children to catch a glimpse of the Duchess. As Charlotte stepped out of the car, she noticed families in the crowd, parents holding their healthy, laughing children. The sight that would normally have brought her joy now felt like a reminder of what Sarah and Emma's family was facing. She waved to the crowd, her smile automatic but her heart heavy. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she held the large ceremonial scissors. The crowd cheered as the ribbon fell, and she managed to deliver her prepared remarks about the importance of community support and volunteerism. Her voice was steady, but those who knew her well might have noticed the slight strain. The tour of the facilities included a nursery area where local parents could leave their toddlers while attending community programs. Charlotte watched as happy children played with toys and laughed with their caregivers. The scene was beautiful and heartwarming, but it pushed her closer to an emotional edge she was struggling to maintain. As the event concluded, Charlotte realized she had one more challenge ahead. The evening reception for military families was perhaps the most important engagement of the day. These families had made tremendous sacrifices for their country, and many had faced losses that Charlotte knew she couldn't fully comprehend. The drive back to the palace provided a brief respite, but Charlotte knew her emotional reserves were running dangerously low. She had always prided herself on her ability to separate her personal struggles from her public duties, but today was testing that ability like never before. Back at the palace, Charlotte had an hour to rest and change for the evening reception. She dismissed her staff, saying she needed a few minutes alone to prepare. Standing in her private sitting room, Charlotte finally allowed herself to think fully about Emma's situation. She remembered Emma's last visit to the palace, how the little girl had been fascinated by the portraits on the walls and had asked endless questions about the princess dresses in Charlotte's wardrobe. Emma had been so full of life, so curious about everything, The thought of that bright spirit being dimmed by illness was almost unbearable. Charlotte picked up her phone several times, wanting to call Sarah, but she knew there was nothing she could say that would help. Sarah needed to focus on Emma and the medical decisions ahead. Charlotte felt helpless, a feeling that was foreign to someone who had grown accustomed to having resources and influence at her disposal. As she prepared for the evening reception, Charlotte tried to summon the strength she would need to face military families, many of whom were dealing with their own profound challenges. She knew they deserved her full attention and respect, but she wasn't sure how much more she could give. The evening gown she selected was a deep navy blue, elegant and appropriate for the formal occasion. As her stylist helped with her hair and makeup, Charlotte practiced her smile in the mirror, trying to recapture the warmth and genuine emotion that usually came naturally to her. The military reception was being held in the palace's grand ballroom. The room had been decorated with subtle military honors, and a string quartet played softly in the background. Charlotte knew that among the guests would be families who had lost sons and daughters in service, as well as those currently deployed overseas. As she made her final preparations, Charlotte felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders. She had never struggled this much to separate her personal emotions from her public duties. The news about Emma had shattered something inside her, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could maintain the perfect facade that was expected of her. The guards had taken their positions throughout the palace, including Sergeant Morrison, who was stationed near the ballroom entrance. As Charlotte prepared to make her entrance, none of them could have predicted that this evening would challenge every protocol they had learned and change their understanding of what it meant to serve with both duty and compassion. The military reception began with all the pomp and ceremony expected of such an occasion. Charlotte entered the grand ballroom to polite applause, her posture perfect and her smile radiating warmth. The guests, a mixture of active military personnel and their families, veterans and military widows, stood as she made her entrance. For the first hour, Charlotte moved through the crowd with her usual grace. She spoke with a young soldier recently returned from overseas deployment, listened to a veteran's stories about his service, and offered comfort to a military spouse whose husband was currently stationed abroad. Each conversation required her full attention and emotional investment. The turning point came when Charlotte was introduced to Margaret Thompson, a military widow whose son had been killed in action just 6 months earlier. Margaret stood quietly beside the ballroom wall, wearing her late son's military medals pinned to her black dress. Her eyes held a depth of grief that Charlotte recognized all too well. As Charlotte approached, Margaret's composure crumbled slightly. She began to speak about her son David, how proud she had been of his service and how empty her house felt without his laughter. Charlotte listened, nodding and offering appropriate words of comfort, but inside, her own carefully constructed emotional walls began to shake. Margaret pulled out a small photograph of David, showing Charlotte a young man in uniform with a bright smile and kind eyes. He had been only 23 years old, just 5 years younger than Emma was now. As Margaret spoke about David's dreams and the future he would never have, Charlotte felt her own grief about Emma's uncertain future rising to the surface. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Charlotte maintaining her professional composure while Margaret shared memories of her son. But when Margaret mentioned how David had always wanted to have children of his own someday, something inside Charlotte finally broke. The realization hit her like a wave. Emma might never have the chance to grow up, to go to university, to fall in love, to have children of her own. All the simple joys and milestones that most people took for granted might be stolen from this innocent 8-year-old girl who still believed in fairy tales and drew pictures of rainbows. Charlotte excused herself politely from Margaret, saying she needed a moment to check on the evening's schedule. But instead of seeking out her private secretary, she found herself walking quickly toward a less crowded area of the palace. Her breathing had become shallow, and she could feel tears threatening to spill over. The corridor leading away from the ballroom was dimly lit and usually empty during events. Charlotte had discovered this quiet space during her early days at the palace when she needed to collect herself between public appearances. She thought she could reach it unnoticed and take a few minutes to regain her composure. But as she rounded the corner, her emotional dam finally burst. 5 years of suppressed feelings, months of growing isolation, and now the devastating news about Emma combined into an overwhelming flood of grief. Charlotte stopped walking and leaned against the wall, her carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. The tears came suddenly and violently. Her shoulders shook as she tried to muffle the sobs that escaped despite her best efforts. All the protocol training in the world couldn't prepare someone for this moment, when human emotion simply refused to be contained any longer. Charlotte slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, her elegant evening gown pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands, no longer caring about her makeup or her appearance. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her pain without trying to push it away or transform it into something more acceptable. The hallway where Charlotte sat was not as private as she had thought. Sergeant James Morrison was stationed at the far end of the corridor as part of the evening's security detail. His position gave him a clear view of the area, while remaining discreet enough not to interfere with any guests who might need to step away from the reception. James had been watching Charlotte throughout the evening, not out of personal curiosity, but as part of his professional duty to monitor potential security concerns. He had noticed her conversations becoming more strained, and her smile becoming more forced as the night progressed. When he saw the Duchess suddenly leave the ballroom and walk quickly down the corridor, his training told him to maintain his position and allow her privacy. Royal family members sometimes needed a moment away from public view, and it wasn't his place to intrude unless there was a security threat. But when he heard the unmistakable sound of someone crying, James found himself in an unprecedented situation. His duty was to protect and serve, but protocol dictated that he maintain his distance. He could see Charlotte sitting on the floor, clearly in distress, but approaching her would be a violation of every rule he had learned in 15 years of service. James stood frozen in his position, torn between his human instinct to help someone in pain and his professional obligation to respect boundaries. He had never faced a situation like this before. His training covered threats to physical safety, but no one had ever taught him what to do when someone under his protection was experiencing emotional crisis. The sound of Charlotte's sobs echoed softly in the quiet corridor. James could see that she was completely unaware of his presence, lost in her grief and vulnerable in a way that no member of the royal family should ever be seen. He knew that if anyone else discovered her in this state, it could create a scandal that would follow her for years. As Charlotte continued to cry, James realized he was facing the most difficult decision of his career. He could maintain protocol and pretend he hadn't seen anything, leaving her alone in her moment of breakdown, or he could break every rule he had ever learned about proper conduct and offer the simple human comfort that anyone in such pain deserved. The weight of that decision hung heavy in the air as Charlotte's tears continued to fall, and James remained motionless at his post, watching a woman who had spent years serving others finally succumb to her own overwhelming grief. James Morrison had served in the military before joining the Royal Guard, and he had seen grown men cry after losing friends in combat. He understood that sometimes the strongest people reached a breaking point, where their pain simply couldn't be contained anymore. But he had never expected to see a member of the royal family in such a raw, vulnerable state. As Charlotte's sobs continued to echo in the corridor, James found himself remembering his own daughter, Lucy, who was now 25 and working as a teacher in Scotland. He thought about how he would want someone to treat Lucy if she were in such distress, regardless of protocol or professional boundaries. The decision crystallized in his mind slowly. James took a step forward, then hesitated. Taking another step would mean crossing a line that could end his career. But leaving Charlotte alone in her pain felt like a betrayal of something deeper than duty, something fundamentally human. Charlotte remained on the floor, her grief consuming her completely. She thought about Emma's bright smile, about Sarah's desperate voice on the phone, about all the children she had met that day who were fighting battles no child should have to face. The weight of feeling helpless in the face of such suffering pressed down on her like a physical force. Through her tears, Charlotte became dimly aware that she was not alone in the corridor. She looked up and saw the figure of a guard standing at the far end of the hallway. Panic shot through her as she realized she had been seen in this compromised state. She tried to wipe her eyes and compose herself, but the tears wouldn't stop coming. James watched as Charlotte attempted to pull herself together, recognizing the futile effort of someone trying to stuff their emotions back into a box that had been permanently broken open. He could see her shoulders shaking with the effort to stop crying, could see her hands trembling as she tried to fix her appearance. In that moment, Charlotte looked up and made direct eye contact with James. Her eyes were red and swollen, her makeup ruined, her hair disheveled. She looked nothing like the composed duchess the world knew, and everything like a heartbroken woman who needed comfort. Something passed between them in that look. Not romance or attraction, but a recognition of shared humanity. Charlotte saw not a guard bound by protocol, but a person who might understand pain. James saw not a royal figure to be protected from a distance, but someone who desperately needed the simple comfort of human connection. Charlotte extended her hand toward James, not in a commanding gesture, but in a plea for help. It was an instinctive action, the kind of reaching out that any person in distress might do when they see another human being nearby. Her hand trembled in the air between them, a bridge across the vast divide that protocol had created. The moment stretched between them like an eternity. James stared at Charlotte's outstretched hand, knowing that taking it would mean abandoning every rule he had lived by for 15 years. But he also knew that ignoring it would mean turning his back on someone who trusted him enough to show her vulnerability. James Morrison made his choice. He walked across the corridor and knelt down beside Charlotte, taking her extended hand in both of his. The gesture was gentle and protective, like a father comforting a child or a friend offering support in a crisis. The moment their hands connected, Charlotte felt a flood of relief that she wasn't facing her pain alone. "It's all right," James said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to hold it all together right now." Charlotte looked at him with surprise and gratitude. In all her years at the palace, no staff member had ever spoken to her with such simple, direct kindness. There were no titles, no formal address, just one human being acknowledging another's pain. "I'm sorry," Charlotte whispered, her voice breaking. "I shouldn't be falling apart like this. I have duties, responsibilities, people counting on me." James squeezed her hand gently. "Even the strongest people need to break sometimes. It doesn't make you weak, Your Grace. It makes you human." The use of her title felt different in this context. Not a barrier, but an acknowledgement that even duchesses were allowed to grieve. Charlotte felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she realized she didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what she was in this moment. A woman in pain. "There's a little girl," Charlotte began, her voice still shaky. "My friend's daughter. She's only 8 years old and she's sick. Really sick. I keep thinking about all the children I met today, and I can't stop imagining her going through what they're going through." James listened without judgment, still holding her hand as she spoke. His presence was steady and calming, like an anchor in a storm. He didn't try to offer solutions or platitudes, just the gift of being heard. "She drew me a picture last month," Charlotte continued, tears still flowing but her voice becoming steadier. "It was a drawing of us having a tea party in the palace garden. She colored my dress bright purple because she said it was a happy color. I have it hanging in my private study." "She sounds like a special little girl," James said quietly. "She is, and I can't help her. I can't fix this. I have all these resources, all this influence, and none of it matters when it comes to cancer in a child. I feel so useless." James understood that feeling of helplessness. He had felt it himself when his own mother was dying, when all his strength and training couldn't protect the person he loved most. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is just love them through it," he said. "Be present. Let them know they're not alone." Charlotte nodded, finding wisdom in his simple words. For several minutes they sat together in the quiet corridor, the formal barriers between them completely dissolved. In the background they could hear the faint sounds of the reception continuing, but that world felt very far away. Slowly, Charlotte's tears began to subside. She felt emotionally drained but also strangely lighter, as if sharing her burden had made it somehow more bearable. James had given her exactly what she needed: permission to be human, to feel pain, and to acknowledge that sometimes strength looked like falling apart and then putting yourself back together again. As Charlotte's breathing returned to normal, both she and James began to realize the magnitude of what had just happened. Protocol hadn't just been bent. It had been completely shattered, but neither of them regretted it. As the reality of the situation began to settle in, both Charlotte and James sat in contemplative silence. The corridor remained quiet except for the distant sounds of the reception, where guests continued their conversations, completely unaware of the profound moment that had just unfolded nearby. Charlotte was the first to speak, her voice still soft but more composed than before. "Sergeant Morrison, isn't it?" she asked, finally looking at his name badge properly for the first time despite having passed him in the hallways countless times over the years. Yes, Your Grace, James Morrison. He was still kneeling beside her, but he had released her hand and was now sitting back slightly, giving her space while remaining close enough to offer support if needed. James, Charlotte repeated, as if testing how it felt to use his first name. In the palace, she rarely addressed staff members by their first names unless they had worked closely together for years. But after what they had just shared, formal titles felt inadequate. How long have you been with the royal household? 15 years this December, Your Grace. Started when I left the army. James's voice carried a hint of pride in his service, but also a note of uncertainty about whether this conversation should be happening at all. Charlotte nodded, processing this information. 15 years, and I'm ashamed to say I never really knew your name until tonight. I see you almost daily, and yet we've never actually spoken. This admission hung in the air between them, highlighting the strange nature of palace life where people could work in the same building for years, without truly knowing each other. The strict hierarchy and protocol created invisible walls that kept everyone in their designated roles, rarely allowing for genuine human connection. That's how it's supposed to be. Your Grace, we're trained to be present but not intrusive, to protect without interfering with your daily life. James spoke matter-of-factly, but there was something in his tone that suggested he had sometimes wondered about the people he was assigned to protect. But that seems so lonely, Charlotte said, and James realized she wasn't just talking about his job. Sometimes I feel like I'm surrounded by people all day long, but I rarely have a real conversation with any of them. Everything is so formal, so scripted. James understood exactly what she meant. He had observed Charlotte over the years, had seen her navigate countless public events with grace and warmth. But he had also noticed the moments when her smile seemed tired, when her shoulders carried a weight that seemed too heavy for one person. Do you have family, James? Charlotte asked, surprising them both with her directness. A daughter, Lucy. She's 25 now, lives in Scotland. Teaches primary school children. James's face lit up slightly when he mentioned her, and Charlotte could see the pride in his eyes. You must miss her. Every day, but I'm proud of what she's doing. She loves those kids like they're her own. James paused, then added, She actually reminds me a bit of you, Your Grace. The way you are with children at the hospital visits. There's something special about people who can connect with kids naturally. Charlotte felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different. Not tears of overwhelming grief, but something more complex. A mixture of sadness and gratitude. I hope I can see Emma that way again, she said quietly. Right now, when I think about her, all I can see is the illness. All I can think about is what she might lose. Maybe that's normal, James suggested gently. When Lucy was 16, she was in a car accident. For months afterward, every time I looked at her, all I could see was how close I came to losing her. It took time before I could see her as herself again, not just as someone who had survived something terrible. Charlotte turned to look at James more fully, seeing him not as a security presence but as a father who had faced his own fears about losing a child. How did you get past that feeling? Lucy helped, actually. She got tired of me treating her like she was made of glass. One day she told me that if I kept looking at her like she was broken, she was going to start believing it herself. She needed me to see her as strong enough to handle whatever came next. These words resonated deeply with Charlotte. She realized that perhaps Emma needed the same thing. Instead of focusing on all the ways cancer might change her young friend's life, maybe Charlotte needed to trust in Emma's strength and resilience. I should call Sarah tomorrow, Charlotte said, more to herself than to James. Emma's mother. I've been afraid to call because I didn't know what to say, but maybe I don't need to have the perfect words. Maybe I just need to let them know I'm here. That sounds right, James agreed. Sometimes just showing up is enough. As they continued talking, both Charlotte and James began to realize how much they had needed this conversation. For Charlotte, it was the first time in months that she had been able to express her fears and vulnerabilities without worrying about how it might affect her public image. For James, it was an opportunity to use his own experiences to help someone else, rather than simply standing guard against external threats. The sound of footsteps in the nearby corridor reminded them both that the reception was still ongoing and that Charlotte's absence might soon be noticed. They both knew that this moment of genuine connection would have to end, that they would need to return to their respective roles. Charlotte began to stand, and James immediately rose to help her, offering his arm for support. As she steadied herself, she realized that her emotional breakdown, while difficult, had somehow left her feeling stronger rather than weaker. "James," she said, smoothing down her dress and checking her appearance in the reflection of a nearby window. "What we shared tonight, this conversation, it means more to me than you might realize. Thank you for choosing kindness over protocol." James felt a warmth in his chest at her words, but also a growing concern about what consequences might follow. "Your Grace, about the protocols we broke tonight." Charlotte held up her hand gently, stopping his words. "What protocols?" "As far as I'm concerned, I took a few minutes to compose myself privately, and you maintained your security position as assigned. Nothing more happened here." The relief in James's eyes was evident, but Charlotte wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "I hope this won't be the last real conversation we have. Within appropriate bounds, of course, but perhaps the palace doesn't have to be quite as formal as we've all been taught to believe." As they prepared to return to their respective duties, both Charlotte and James knew that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of service, duty, and human compassion. The evening's events had proven that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply see them as a person first, regardless of their title or position. Charlotte returned to the reception with a renewed sense of purpose. Her makeup had been carefully repaired, her dress smoothed, and to most observers she appeared to be the same composed duchess who had left the ballroom earlier. But internally everything had changed. The conversation with Margaret Thompson, the military widow, took on new meaning now. When Charlotte approached her again, she no longer felt overwhelmed by the woman's grief. Instead, she felt equipped to offer something more substantial than polite sympathy. She sat with Margaret for nearly 20 minutes, listening to more stories about David, and sharing her own thoughts about loss and hope. Other guests began to notice a subtle difference in Charlotte's interactions. She seemed more present, more genuine in her conversations. Where before she had been gracious but slightly distant, now she appeared to be fully engaged with each person she met. She lingered longer with a young military wife whose husband was deployed overseas, offering not just royal acknowledgement but real comfort. James, meanwhile, returned to his position with a conflicted sense of purpose. Professionally, he had violated nearly every principle of Royal Protection Service. Personal involvement with protected individuals was strictly forbidden, and physical contact was only acceptable in security situations. Yet he felt no regret about his actions, only a deep sense that he had done the right thing. Throughout the remainder of the evening, James found himself observing Charlotte with new eyes. He could see the effort she put into each interaction, the emotional labor required to be fully present for every person she met. He began to understand that royal duty wasn't just about public appearances and ceremonial functions. It was about carrying the hopes and sorrows of countless people. When the reception finally ended and the last guest had departed, Charlotte made an unusual request. Instead of retiring immediately to her private quarters, as was her custom, she asked to speak briefly with the senior household staff who had worked the evening event. In a small sitting room adjacent to the ballroom, Charlotte addressed the dozen staff members who had coordinated the evening's activities. Among them were servers, coordinators, and security personnel, including James. "I wanted to thank you all personally for tonight," Charlotte began, her voice carrying a warmth that went beyond the usual polite acknowledgments. "I know that hosting these events requires enormous coordination and effort from all of you, often behind the scenes where your work goes unnoticed." The staff members exchanged surprised glances. While Charlotte had always been considerate, this level of personal attention was unprecedented. More importantly, Charlotte continued, "I realize tonight that I don't know many of you as well as I should. We work together regularly, but we rarely have the opportunity to connect as people. I'd like to change that within appropriate bounds, of course." She then did something remarkable. She went around the room and introduced herself personally to each staff member, asking their names, how long they had worked at the palace, and something about their lives outside of work. For many of them, it was the first time they had exchanged more than professional pleasantries with a member of the royal family. When Charlotte reached James, their eyes met briefly, and she simply said, "Thank you for your service tonight, James. Your professionalism and dedication are deeply appreciated." To anyone listening, it sounded like a standard acknowledgement, but James understood the deeper meaning behind her words. The changes in Charlotte's behavior became more apparent in the following days. She began greeting staff members by name in the hallways, remembering details about their families and interests. She instituted informal monthly coffee sessions where household staff could share concerns or suggestions about improving palace operations. Most significantly, Charlotte called Sarah the next morning. The conversation was difficult but healing. Instead of trying to find perfect words of comfort, Charlotte simply offered her presence and support. She arranged for Emma to receive the best possible medical care and made it clear that she would be available throughout the treatment process. When Emma began her chemotherapy treatments, Charlotte visited her regularly. Instead of formal hospital visits with photographers and protocol officers, these were private moments where Charlotte simply sat with a sick child, reading stories, playing games, and providing the kind of steady, loving presence that Emma needed. James noticed these changes in Charlotte's approach to her role, and they inspired changes in his own perspective on service. He began to see his job not just as protecting the royal family from external threats, but as creating an environment where they could be their most authentic selves while serving others. During quiet moments at his security post, James found himself thinking about the conversation he and Charlotte had shared. It had reminded him of why he had chosen service in the first place, not just to follow orders and maintain protocols, but to contribute to something larger than himself. The other guards began to notice James's renewed enthusiasm for his work. He volunteered for additional duties, offered to mentor newer security personnel, and approached his responsibilities with a sense of purpose that went beyond mere professionalism. Charlotte's transformation had ripple effects throughout the household. Other staff members began to feel more valued and connected to their work. The atmosphere in the palace became less rigid and more collaborative. People started taking initiative to solve problems and improve operations. Rather than simply following established procedures, the royal family's public engagements also benefited from Charlotte's evolution. Her interactions with the public became more genuine and impactful. People sensed the change in her approach and responded with increased warmth and openness. Media coverage began to highlight not just Charlotte's charitable work, but her unique ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Emma's treatment proved successful, and after several months of chemotherapy, she entered remission. Charlotte was there for every milestone, from the first reduction in tumor size to the final clear scan. The experience of supporting Emma and Sarah through their ordeal had taught Charlotte that sometimes the most meaningful royal duty was simply being present for people during their most vulnerable moments. The friendship between Charlotte and James developed within carefully maintained professional boundaries. They never again shared the kind of intimate conversation they had experienced that night in the corridor, but their mutual respect and understanding informed all their subsequent interactions. James came to understand that protecting Charlotte meant more than just ensuring her physical safety. It meant creating space for her to be human, to feel deeply and to connect authentically with the people she served. Charlotte, in turn, recognized that the people who served the royal household were not just functional positions, but individuals with their own stories, struggles, and wisdom to offer. Their brief encounter that evening had demonstrated that sometimes the most important protocols to break are the ones that prevent us from seeing each other's humanity. In a world of rigid hierarchies and formal procedures, they had discovered that genuine human connection was not a luxury, but a necessity for meaningful service. 2 years after that transformative evening in the palace corridor, Charlotte stood in the same hospital where her emotional journey had begun. But this time she wasn't there as a duchess fulfilling official duties. She was there as a friend, watching Emma ring the bell that marked the end of her cancer treatment. Emma, now 10 years old and with her hair grown back in wild curls, beamed with joy as the clear, bright sound echoed through the pediatric oncology ward. Charlotte felt tears in her eyes, but these were tears of celebration rather than grief. The little girl who had once drawn pictures of tea parties was now cancer-free and full of plans for her future. "Aunt Charlotte," Emma said, using the informal title that Charlotte had encouraged, "will you come to my school's art exhibition next month? I'm entering the drawing I made of you in your purple dress." Charlotte laughed, remembering that original purple dress drawing that still hung in her study. "I wouldn't miss it for the world, sweetheart." Sarah stood nearby, watching the interaction with profound gratitude. The past 2 years had been the most challenging of her life. But having Charlotte's genuine friendship and support had made an enormous difference. Charlotte had kept her promise to be present throughout the journey, visiting during treatment sessions, celebrating small victories, and offering comfort during the most frightening moments. The relationship between Charlotte and the household staff had evolved significantly since that night. The monthly coffee sessions had become a beloved tradition, and Charlotte now knew not just the names but the personal stories of most of the people who worked at the palace. She knew about James's daughter Lucy, who had recently become engaged to a fellow teacher. She knew about Margaret, the head cook whose grandson was learning to play violin. She knew about Thomas, the groundskeeper, whose wife was expecting their first baby. James Morrison had been promoted to head of personal security, a role that required him to work even more closely with Charlotte and her family. The promotion came not just because of his experience and reliability, but because his approach to protection had evolved to include emotional and psychological well-being, alongside physical safety. The night in the corridor was never explicitly discussed between them again, but it had fundamentally changed how James understood his role. He had learned to read the subtle signs when Charlotte was struggling with difficult emotions, and he had developed discreet ways to ensure she had the space and support she needed during challenging times. Charlotte's transformation had not gone unnoticed by the media and the public. Royal correspondents began writing about her common touch and her ability to connect with people in ways that seemed effortless but were actually the result of intentional personal growth. Her charitable work became more focused and effective because she approached it with genuine emotional investment, rather than dutiful obligation. The changes Charlotte had implemented at the palace began to influence other royal households. Her approach to staff relations, her integration of mental health considerations into royal duties, and her emphasis on authentic human connection became a model that was quietly studied and emulated by other royal families. Prince Edward had watched his wife's evolution with admiration and pride. He had always loved Charlotte's compassionate nature, but he had worried about how the pressures of royal life might diminish that quality over time. Instead, he had witnessed her find ways to make her natural empathy an asset rather than a vulnerability. Emma's recovery had taught Charlotte important lessons about resilience and hope that she carried into all her work. When she visited sick children in hospitals, she no longer felt overwhelmed by their suffering. Instead, she saw their strength and potential. When she met with military families dealing with loss, she could offer not just sympathy but genuine understanding of how to find meaning in the midst of pain. The palace corridor where Charlotte had experienced her breakdown became, in her mind, a sacred space. Sometimes, when she felt overwhelmed by her responsibilities, she would walk through that hallway and remember the moment when someone had chosen compassion over protocol. It reminded her that even in the most formal environments, there was always room for human kindness. James often reflected on the decision he had made that night. In his 15 years of service, he had prevented security breaches, managed crowd control situations, and handled numerous protocol challenges. But the moment he chose to offer comfort to a grieving woman remained the action he was most proud of in his career. His daughter Lucy had visited the palace several times, and Charlotte had made a point of getting to know her personally. Lucy often joked that her father had become famous in their family for making the Duchess cry, not understanding the full story but recognizing that something significant had happened between her father and his employer, and the ripple effects of that single moment of human connection continued to spread throughout the royal household and beyond. Staff members felt more valued and engaged in their work. Public engagements became more meaningful and impactful. The royal family's relationship with the British people felt more authentic and connected. Charlotte established a foundation focused on supporting families dealing with childhood illness. With Emma serving as one of the first young ambassadors, the foundation's approach emphasized not just medical support, but emotional and psychological resources for entire families facing health crises. On the anniversary of that difficult evening, Charlotte made it a tradition to write personal thank you notes to all the household staff, acknowledging their contributions not just to royal operations, but to the human environment that made her work possible. She never explicitly referenced the conversation with James, but she always made sure his note included a line about service that goes beyond duty to encompass true care. James kept every one of those notes, not out of pride but as reminders of the kind of leader Charlotte had become and the kind of service he aspired to provide. He had learned that sometimes the most important part of protecting someone was creating space for them to be vulnerable, to feel deeply and to connect authentically with others. Emma's art exhibition was a tremendous success, and her drawing of Charlotte in the purple dress won first place in the youth category. As Charlotte stood in the school gymnasium, surrounded by children's artwork and proud families, she marveled at how much her life had changed since that dark night when she thought she was losing her ability to serve effectively. She had learned that strength wasn't about maintaining perfect composure at all times. Instead, it was about allowing yourself to be human, to feel deeply and to accept help when you needed it. Most importantly, she had discovered that the best service came not from following protocols perfectly, but from connecting authentically with the people you were meant to serve. The story of Charlotte's breakdown and recovery became a quiet legend within the palace walls, passed down among staff members as an example of what could happen when formal barriers were temporarily set aside in favor of simple human compassion. It served as a reminder that even in the most structured environments, there was always room for kindness, understanding, and genuine human connection. Years later, when new staff members joined the household, they would eventually hear whispered stories about the night when protocol was dropped in favor of humanity, and how that single moment of authentic connection had transformed not just one person, but an entire approach to royal service. It became a testament to the power of choosing compassion over convention, and the lasting impact that one moment of genuine human kindness could have on countless lives.